Hey, everybody out there in Twitch. Carlos A.S. Lising again here with our newest edition of Castle Talk. I'm pleased to be able to introduce Jeff Talanian, one of my good friends over here, and the mastermind behind Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea. Jeff, how you doing tonight?
Great. How about yourself?
I'm doing awesome. Thank you very much. Uh, Jeff, thank you again for being here, for talking, having this conversation with us.
Thank you
A
for
lot of
having me.
everybody out there in Greyhawk, when I go to the Facebook pages and I go to different chat rooms, we talk a lot about, the Gary's legacy, Gary Gygax's legacy to the game, which is immense. I mean, he casts an immensely long shadow over all of us, but uh, I don't often hear a lot of people when we talk about Greyhawk talk about his career after TSR and how influenced Greyhawk. Mr. Talanian, Jeff over here, has a huge amount of background with that, having worked with him on the Castle Zagyg project through
Yes.
through Troll Lord. Uh, but first, before we even get into that, Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on right now with Northwind?
So I have a small publishing company called Northwind Adventures, and we are the publishers of Astonishing, Swordsmen, and Swords of Hyperborea. It's a sword and sorcery field game. It uses school mechanics, but the theme behind it is the pulp fiction of authors such as Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, H.P. Lovecraft, and sort of the weird tales version of a classic role-playing style game. So what we do is sort of merge the old school aesthetic to this type of sword and sorcery feel that you would find in the pulps.
Absolutely, there's a huge feel, a vibe of it, and Jeff and I were talking about it a little bit before we went live. The Robert E. Howard field is strong to it. The Lovecraft feel to it is strong. Uh, I
Sure.
also forgot to mention the whole uh, Grey Mouser and Fafred feel to it. The Lankmar feel is very strong in it too. And for those of you who out there haven't seen
Oh, absolutely.
Jeff's products before, this is Hyperborea right over here, your player's guide. Uh, he the stuff out there for those of you who are Greyhawk enthusiasts, it's stuff that you're really gonna like a lot. I wouldn't. It's one of the few systems out there. Everyone knows that I'm a stalwart first edition guy. It's one of the few systems out there that I would really recommend that you guys check out because it harkens back to all the things you love so much about the game. Uh, Jeff,
Thank you.
what else is going on right now with you guys?
Well, we just uh, finished producing two new adventure modules for Hyperborea. Uh, there was two adventures that we kickstarted successfully, and now we're in the midst of fulfillment of those two books. One is called The Lost Treasure of Atlantis, and the other one is called The Seawolf's Daughter.
Yeah.
And they're both higher level adventures. We've done a lot of lower to mid level stuff in the past, mostly mid level stuff, because that seems to be sort of the sweet spot. But these are both for the Hyperborea game, which essentially goes up to about level 12 for characters. It is on the higher end of, 7th through ninth level type of adventuring.
Yeah, I one of the things that you'll really like about Northwind projects through Hyperborea is I've never really seen Kickstarters run so well. You guys are always on time with things. I've never been disappointed with any one of you guys' different programs, and I think in this day and age where you see a lot of late projects and things like that, that in and of itself is a massive, massive coup for you guys.
Well, thank you. And I can sympathize with folks who run into these stumbling blocks and end up being months and sometimes up to a year late with things because I understand all the things that can go wrong and all the little delays that can build up like a mountain.
Oh
So basically, our process is pretty simple for how we do these crowdfunding campaigns. The first thing we always do is make sure that the writing is complete before we would ever ask someone to fork up their hard-earned pay for this, small amount of entertainment. So the writing has to be done. The editing and art have to be well underway. Usually we have the cover to show. So when the writing is done, the cover is done, you're in the process of editing, interior art is rolling in. then I think you're at the point where you can say, okay, now we can do a crowdfunding campaign for this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, like I said, I think you guys do it right. And I think that if you wanted to model a Kickstarter program after yours, that would be you could do a lot worse for sure. One of our main supporters out there who's watching the show over there just also endorsed Hyperborea. My friend Gaetano. Gaetano, you're right, absolutely. It's a great game with a real old school vibe to it. So yeah, I think it seems like maybe a few more of the Greyhawk crowd are in on it than I maybe than
Oh,
I thought
absolutely.
before.
There's a, Greyhawk was always my favorite setting growing up. And so it definitely inspired me for a lot of what I did. In fact, when I was a kid, I took my old Darlene Greyhawk maps, and I was probably too young to be able to absorb all the stuff in the original Greyhawk folio and box set, because it was intense reading for a 10 or 11-year-old kid. But so I would make up, in my own from my own neighborhood friends, a lot of the things that were on that map.
Oh,
What a
sure.
certain city was,
Hmm.
or where an adventuring site might be. So it's like but it really, that box set and those maps really sparked my imagination back then.
Yeah, that for me, I remember the same. I was I remember thinking to myself when I used to when I was looking at it for the first time. I think I was in the same boat you were, where it was a lot to absorb. Uh, I was very fascinated by the gods always. I would look at those stats up and down, and I
Yes,
would pore over the different things, and just it lent so much of a personality to the setting that I hadn't
right,
seen anywhere else, and it informed me a little bit as a future creator about what it took, I think, to lend particular character and a feel to a setting. But let's go
sure.
back a little bit to your whole background with Greyhawk. About how old were you when you got? And it was the gold set for you first.
How old was I when I got into D&D?
Yeah.
Oh, so I was in the fifth grade, so I was probably about 10 years old
Okay.
or 11 years old, and I think it must have been bad weather outside because it was indoor recess,
Okay.
and one of my friends brought it to school, and I believe he had brought in the Holmes basic set. It may have been Mold Bay. It may have been the earliest version of Bay, but whatever the case it was, we played during recess, and then we loved it so much that we wanted to go play after school as well, and that's
Oh,
how
nice.
I got sucked into playing D&D, and I loved it so much that I needed to have it for myself. So I found it. I don't know if you remember back in the day, the old Sears wish book, the big
Oh yeah,
Sears
absolutely.
book that they said. So it was so D&D was in the Sears wish book, and I
Mhm.
ordered Dungeons and Dragons. It was the Holmes box set that I started with. So I
That's
started playing with Holmes D&D, and I had a paper route at the time,
uh,
and I saved my paper route money, and I bought a Dungeon Master's Guide. So I was running D&D games for my neighborhood friends
mhm.
using just the Holmes box set and the DMG.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's how I ran D&D for the longest time. Now I remember there was another kid who got a player's handbook in the neighborhood, and we used to all look at his book.
Right.
So it's just like one of those types of situations. There was, and there was no internet to tell us we were doing things wrong.
And I think there's something really pure about that experience. I mean, I know for myself, I was in a similar boat. I remember I had gotten exposed to it through Redbox at a friend's house, and I thought to myself, "Wow!" I thought, this is really cool. And somehow I ended up getting the expert book before the basic, and so there was a massive void, obviously, in my knowledge of it. So you just make it up as you go.
Right, right.
But I see that some of the people that are watching out there on Twitch, thank you again for joining in with us. Arameth here over here mentions that he's run a Greyhawk game using AS and SH at GaryCon in the past, and the players seem to think it was a good fit. So
Yeah,
I
I've
think
heard
that's
that
really
about
cool.
Lankmar as well, Greyhawk.
Mhm.
People have run it with other stuff.
And another one of my friends says here that Hyperborea is the northern top of their Earth map now before it was separated. So I think that's anyone who's seen the map before, and they see the there actually is a something that you can kind of attach Hyperborea to if you really
Sure,
want to. I
yeah.
think that that's pretty cool.
That's one way you could do it. Yeah. It's open to your imagination.
Okay, so you got this when you were in fifth grade and you started playing and everything like that.
Yep.
So what would you say your at that point in time? What was the big attraction to D&D for you at that point? Were you a big reader?
Well, yeah, I was. So I think as I got a little bit older and I started to read more. So I think when I started playing D&D, I'd already read The Hobbit, and I used to read the Marvel comics, Conan comic books, and so I think those were some of my earliest influences. But then as I got a little bit older, sixth grade, seventh grade, I started to read Lord of the Rings. I got into the Elric books, Fritz Leiber. I started to experiment with all these other different, writers. And so a lot of them were inspiring how I was running my games. In fact, you mentioned about, the gods and the Greyhawk and how you were fascinated. I was fascinated with those too. But then at some point in my early dungeon mastering career, I think I became infatuated with Walter Simonson's run on the Mighty Thor.
How could you not be?
So I decided that I wanted to run a Ragnarok campaign, and that I would incorporate what Walt Simonson was doing in Thor into my own Greyhawk campaign. So it's like, sort of a melting pot of all these things back then that you would pull into your games.
That's fantastic. I mean, for me, I'm a huge Simonson guy too, so I think that's really. In fact, he's doing another Ragnarok book right now that's outside of Thor that's really amazing too. But that's another subject. I just saw that the Aramef, who was mentioning that about Hyperborea, is our good buddy Rich Frank's
Oh, okay,
alias there
Rich.
online. Rich is one of my dearest friends in the hobby too,
Yeah,
so
Rich is a
I'm
great
glad you
guy.
could watch with us tonight, bud.
Thank
Um,
you.
but yeah, that's those things are very compelling about the setting, those earliest memories that you have. How did you transition from your love of Dungeons and Dragons, your just your first love of it and doing that as a kid into a professional?
I'm sorry, I lost that. Your voice is breaking up a little
Oh,
bit.
that's okay. What I asked you
How
was
did I transition from what?
how did you transition from your first love of the game into actually being a professional?
Well, that didn't come until the mid 2000s. I was the constant dungeon master through my whole life from when I was a kid. I was always running different campaigns for different groups of people. In fact, the current group that I play with, we've been gaming together since 1992.
Wow.
So I was always writing my own materials, but I also had a love for fiction as well. So I was at that time in the early 2000s, I was writing a lot of short stories, and I was working on a novel, and I was kind of struggling with it. And I decided I wanted to give a try at writing some gaming materials. So I was writing different stuff at the time, and it was also during a period of my life where I was getting a little disenfranchised with how third edition D&D worked at the later levels, and how complex it was for me as a dungeon master. And I wanted to harken back to the sort of games I enjoyed running the best. So I decided I want to run Greyhawk again. I want to start getting back into that. So I was digging into all my old, Greyhawk folio and the different modules that I loved. My favorite was always the Lost Caverns of Zagyg. And so looking at all these different, modules that I loved from back in the day. And so I decided to see, like, what's going on in Greyhawk today. So I started to do some research online, and I stumbled into the most fascinating thing. I found that Gary Gygax was getting back into Greyhawk, with the serial numbers filed off, Castle Zagyg, and was intending on publishing his long-awaited dungeon that we had been reading about in Dragon magazine since I was a kid. So I thought it was amazing, and I saw that he had out a call for freelance writers at the time. So I was, I didn't think that I would actually get this job, but I submitted to him a cover letter and a writing sample, and I had picked up the first hardback and that he had come out with here with Troll Lord Games, that
There it is.
the Igsberg, which details the sort of town city environs where Castle Zagyg was centered around. So I studied that, and I actually wrote a series of different encounter areas and submitted those to him as well, and said these are the type of stuff that I could, submit. He was looking for developers to take what was in this hardback book and expand on it further, and have a sort of a crew of different freelance writers who would all contribute to it. So I got accepted onto that team, and I started to write city supplements for Eggsburg, which was for Castle Zagyg, and then my role continued to expand from there.
That is, I can only imagine how surreal it must have felt to be working with, a guy like Gary. That thank you for joining us, man, Alicia. I appreciate that. Uh, how surreal it must have felt for you.
Yeah, it really was. I've told the story before. The probably the most surreal part was the opening part of it. Like, so when I submitted my cover letter and writing samples to him, I believe it was on like a Friday evening, right? So I said, yeah, I'm not going to hear from him, for probably weeks. And then it was Monday morning, the next Monday morning, that I opened up my email and I saw Gary Gygax in my inbox, and I looked at it and I said, I don't want to open this. This is gonna be my polite form rejection letter, probably, which I had gotten used to with some of my short story submissions, because I was submitting to, like, Isaac Asimov science fiction. I was trying to get into these big time markets, and I had gotten into some fanzines and things like that, but nothing of a larger market. I got used to getting the form rejection letter. And so when I opened it and he welcomed me to the team, I was just shocked and amazed.
Wow. Did you were you able to speak to him face to face shortly afterwards?
Yeah, so I did meet him in person. I went to his house in Lake Geneva. The first time I met him in person in that context was in 2006, and it was nice, spending time at his house, talking about gaming and literature, and just Gary was a big, obviously a fan of things outside of game. He was a football fan. He was a sports enthusiast for his Chicago teams, and so we kind of hit it off. We had a little bit of a rivalry with some things, because he used to like to bust my chops about how the '85 Bears absolutely crushed my Patriots in the Super Bowl. He used to send me Super Bowl shuffle videos and stuff like that. But anyway, when I first met him, it was great. My wife and I met him, and it was just like a great experience, meeting him. He was so excited. He was such a genuine guy, to meet one of your childhood idols. Gary was always one of my idols growing up, him and Stan Lee. And
Right.
so meeting him in person, it was just like, it was amazing for me, because he was such a nice guy and so genuine. And he was excited about the little things. He had been working on his own baked beans all day that he had cooked himself, and he was excited to, have everyone try them out. He was just a great guy.
My personal experience for talking with Gary was similar to yours in a way. I remember when I first emailed him. I'm was born and raised in Chicago, and so we talked about the Bears more than we talked about anything else really. At first, I thought that was pretty cool. So, and I'm going to leave out what happened in that Super Bowl to you, but I will say this: that that I think the Patriots have gotten revenge on everybody by this point, right?
We did score first in that Super Bowl.
That's true. You did. That's true. Um, at any rate, though, after you started getting a chance to speak to Gary about once the pleasantries were done, what did you and you guys actually started getting the nitty gritty of doing design? What were you struck by his game design aesthetic when you actually had a chance to see it up close and personal for yourself? The way that his process went.
Yeah, his process was enlightening for me from an organizational standpoint, because you could tell that he was used to having many irons in the fire, many projects going with different publishers at the same time. So Gary was he was a consummate outliner. He would supply all these outlines, and then supply context to the outlines, so that you would be given minimal guidance with some aspects of the outline, and great fleshed out amounts of content for other parts of the outline. So it was really nice to see how he went about attacking a project, and it helped me develop my own sort of people get a lot of people who are aspiring writers, or whether it's for role-playing games, comic books, short stories, television, whatever it may be. People tend to get intimidated by the blank page. Where do I start? How do I get over the hump for this thing? And I think what Gary's process is that he would come up with these nuggets of ideas and expand on them and reorganize them and expand on them again, so that once he had it sort of organized in these hierarchies, you're able to actually attack the project, and not necessarily from the start. You may be looking at part one of a project and say, I don't really know how I want to start this, so I'm going to start over here on part 4 because I really know what I want to do with that part of it. So you can approach it from different angles like that.
Yeah, sort of an immediate res kind of process here. I noticed that one of my good friends over here, another huge supporter of Castle Entertainment from very much the get-go, Lamashtu over here, just said 85 patriots with a heart behind it. So you're not alone here, Jeff. Just so you know that you got some fellow Patriots fans out there.
There are a few of us. Most of us are hated these days, though.
Oh, I admire the team, actually. I think anyone who has the kind of success that you have, I wish the Bears could have it, and I think it's admirable more than anything. It's just amazing to see a team that's that competitive year after year. But this is Castle Talk, not NFL Talk, so forgive me out there for you guys who don't like sports ball. I'll digress. When you started doing work with Gary, and you're starting to kind of get into the castle a little bit, uh, what did he say that was kind of what did he want to convey that he felt was most important, do you think?
Well, I think Gary was very trusting. He would provide guidance. He would provide content to parts that he really wanted to see, but he would leave it up to me to develop individual parts and expand on parts as I saw fit. And then he would take a look at them, and he would like some things, he would hate some things, and he didn't mince words. He wasn't gonna. He was pretty blunt about going through each part of what I was working on with him. So he was very trusting, but he was hands-on at the same time, and he would allow me to have the freedom to develop creatively as I saw fit for the project. But I think that came with trust over time, because I had worked with him for so long on the Iggsburg City project. I had started off with one project on one part of that project, I should say, and as other developers were either had other commitments in life or whatever and couldn't complete, I was taking over their projects and taking more of a lead role with the development of that city. So I think that by the time I started working, when Gary asked me to, and Steve Chenault from Troll Lord Games asked me to develop the main castle with Gary, I was thrilled to be doing it. But for Gary, like I said, he always had many irons in the fire. So while I was working on Castle Zagyg, on his fleshing out his outlines and working on expanding content, he was very much working on his legendary Asteroids, which was a science fiction version of Legendary Adventures.
Mm-hmm.
He was also working on a card game called King of England, King of France, which was a card war game based on the 100 Years' War. And so he was always involved with different stuff. I know fans would like to think that he was 100% committed to his Greyhawk materials, but Gary's tastes were all over the map. and he was, he would do what he was most interested in that particular day.
I've read Jim Ward, when he was on our show earlier, mentioned that he'd never met anyone with as much energy as Gary had, and it seems his work and his ability to juggle multiple projects like that in so many different veins seems to support that. I would think. Did you experience that as well? That he was that he had just that kind of driving passion for it?
Yeah, absolutely. He would have these, sometimes his emails were hard to decipher because it was like he would have this stream of consciousness, the, creative bursts where he would, where I would get a series of emails in the course of like one night from him in which he would uh, describe what he would want to see on, level 6A of the dungeon. And it was this, I really want this encounter to be somewhere there. And he would have this big write up on it and say, this is going to be here and this is going to be there. And he would have these creative explosions of material. And then he would go quiet, and then I would send him stuff, and then he would comment on it. So it would kind of go back and forth. So I would imagine that when he wasn't having these creative bursts for the stuff that I was working on, he was doing it with other stuff that he was maybe working on with guys like Chris Clark with the Legendary Adventure stuff, and different other people he was working on with other projects.
I don't know if you're following the Twitch feed right now, as well as having the conversation. I'm going to
Oh no,
read a couple of the comments here from people.
sure.
One of my friend Lamashtu over here has mentioned his favorite ranger character was killed off brutally by the DM running Saltmarsh on the same day that the Super Bowl happened. So he ended up watching the catastrophe because of that. So basically, he got the double whammy, I think, for that. The next guy over here is Jason Zavoda. Jason Zavoda is actually responsible for the great Encyclopedia Greyhawk
Oh
Honor.
yes, I remember Jason. Yeah, he's a great guy.
Yeah, Jason's a great guy, and he mentions that sounds like a real treasure trove of Gygaxian material out there. Um, and he mentions that Jeff is a spiritual inheritor of that Gygaxian creative awesomeness, which is pretty high praise.
Oh, that's very nice.
One of our other newer friends, Zach Schooley, who just subscribed to our feed the other day, mentioned that he'll second that. And I realize that AS and SH is an incredible setting. Someone else mentions that Hyperborea feels very Gygaxian. Of course, he was equally inspired by the pulp stories which Gary was drawn to. Yeah, there's a lot of love out here for what you're doing and what you've done in the past.
Right.
So I think that's pretty
One
awesome.
one of the things that I do like to mention for my own work is that not only have I been inspired by writers like Michael Moorcock and Clark Ashton Smith and Fritz Leiber, Jack Vance, all the classics, right? But I also look at like what Gygax and Arneson created, and all their collaborators, Rob Kuntz, uh, different, all the different classic Greyhawk writers that came along. There's just so many of them to name. I look at what everything that they did as sort of its own mythology. And I take that mythology and I also use that as an inspiration in itself. I know that original D&D and AD&D were also these melting pots of influences for the various writers and collaborators, and that they were, sort of riffing on the things that they enjoyed reading. If it's if you're talking about like I was just looking at a classic over here a short while ago. Is one of my favorites.
Oh yeah, Tomo-chan.
Yeah, so you could take a cultural piece like that and and incorporate it into any type of campaign setting. And I really came to appreciate how you could take all these different like cultural influences. You can have something that feels like that, and then you can jump to something that's Viking themed, Norse mythology.
Mm-hmm.
And I always was amazed by how D&D was able to pull that off.
Right.
And so that is also a huge inspiration to me.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. That you can definitely reflect a lot of different, especially in Greyhawk, because it's such a vast world with and it pulls very directly from a lot of different cultures, and at least spiritually it does. You can reflect a lot, just about anything you really want to, as far as an homage piece. Um, which actually you just almost hit exactly on what I was about ready to ask you. As a writer, and you do a lot of different projects. You mentioned you write short stories. You and I have talked about comic books and things like that as well. I know for myself, depending on the specific project I'm writing for, I have a different voice for everything I try and write for. When you're trying to write in a Greyhawk voice, Jeff, what do you feel is like the most important kind of things that you think are important in order to capture that feel, the right feel for it?
Well, I think that not necessarily just for Greyhawk, but for anything that you're trying to really, you could be writing a Tarzan pastiche, or you could be writing a Greyhawk, inspired adventure. Whatever the case may be, I think it's always important to sort of study and absorb the source material, but don't necessarily ape it to such a sense that you're losing your own voice. Because I think that you as a creator need to bring something to the table yourself. So I think it's a combination of being versed and really familiar with what you're doing, and really and being genuine about it too, not just saying like, today I think I like Forgotten Realms, so I'm going to write some Forgotten Realms. I'm going to look at this source book and I'm going to expand on it. You have to really, I think it's kind of like, I think it's false to do it that way. I think you have to really have a genuine passion for it.
Right.
So for me, it was always Greyhawk as far as D&D went. And then, beyond that, I was always into, Robert E. Howard, and, of course, like Savage Sword of Conan and things like that. So those are things that inspired me.
We were talking a little bit before you went on the air about your personal Greyhawk group, or your personal DMing, and that you'd had a very long running, well over 20 years group. What were your stomping grounds in Greyhawk? What kind of materials did you guys use to play around with when you were just playing the game?
Well, when I was young, when I was a teenager, I would use the Darlene maps, and I would run campaigns off that. And so but I would incorporate all the, the classic Greyhawk adventures. And, I would look at when you look at the Lost Caverns of Zagyg, that tells you where it's located. So I would, work on getting, of course, when you're a kid, you're trying to figure out like, all right, how am I going to get the guys over to this part of Greyhawk now? Because that was always the thing with me. I wouldn't want to just say like, okay, you're suddenly right here right now. I would want to come up with some rationale, even then, about how they would get from point A to point B, and and give them motivation for taking part in these various escapades. So I really enjoyed the openness of that map, that that these different modules take place in different parts of Greyhawk, but you're also but there's so much open space for you to develop different parts in your own. So like I said, I was a huge comic book fan back then, so I would take different comic book storylines that I was interested in, and of course, like, Stormbringer found its way somewhere in my campaign, of course. Well, and then I discovered, there was Black Razor, and I was like, oh, there's already is a Stormbringer type of swords in this
There's
game.
actually two. The Carl Sargent material introduced one, that Hunger, that's over in the Adri Forest. So
Oh, really?
there's multiple kinds of that. You want to go there, you can go there.
Right. So I just thought it was great. Great. So I mean, it actually inspired me to today, the stuff that I work on today, because I have my Hyperborea campaign setting, and we have the rules for it and everything. But then the various modules that we publish take place in different parts of Hyperborea. So there are a lot of unnamed, unmarked places on the map that individual game referees can develop on their own, or they can use, our modules that will flesh out a certain area and have an adventure that takes place in a certain area. So I kind of like that. I love settings, but I also do encourage, some of the most fun games that I've had growing up was when I just, took a big sheet of easel paper and drew a giant map and created my own setting. And, you don't need to have all this massive amount of writing to get it done. You could have bullet point lists and, stuff like that, because if you're not aiming towards publication, you don't need to, a lot of it's up here.
Right.
So, so it's just so much fun to create, and then of course what the players bring to the table, and so you as the dungeon master or the game referee, you're sort of riffing off them sometimes and what they come up with. So it really is, creative collaboration in a lot of sense.
If you mentioned the kind of the minimalist approach there a little bit. Two guys that are in our community that I think really do a great job of that. Jason Zavoda, we mentioned him before. In his Hall of the Mountain King stuff, he doesn't spend uh, too much time dwelling on particular subjects. He just hits you with enough to give you a nice idea, and you're like, wow, that's really inspirational, and you can move with that. Just like there's a gentleman that's on Tribality that named Blake that does some good work like that as well. It's just these short bullet point ideas, and it's opens your eyes maybe to something you hadn't seen before. So I think you're absolutely right when you say that there's a brevity sometimes is it's the way to go. If I have a weakness for my own work, sometimes I think I'm a little bit too long-winded, but I blame
Yeah,
Gary's.
we all tend to be. And then I think that you could become, as a creator of this adventure material, you can sort of self-assess a little bit more by looking at the works of others.
Yeah.
Because if you're running an adventure that somebody else wrote and you open it up and say you browsed it a couple times, read it through before you ran it for your group of friends, and then it's game night and you're running it, and suddenly the group has gone from, and they've gone from encounters 1, 2, and 3 on the map to taking a left and going down this long hall and banging another right, and before you know it, they're at encounter number 47. So you're flipping the pages to see what's in the key for this, and you open up to encounter number 47, and you see these giant blocks of text, and you stare at it, and you're like, I can't absorb all this right now in my mind. You've got these people in front of you who are immersed in what's going on. And so if suddenly you've got your head buried in a book and you're trying to figure out what's going on, you could lose them. You could lose the group, and you can lose their attention. That's when they take out their phones and start looking at stuff or whatever.
Yeah, and you can tell right away you need to adjust your style a little bit when that kind of comes up. You've got a somebody over here mentioning the Black Knight 666 mentions playing right out of your butt, and I think there's a lot to be said for that for sure.
Right.
As far as now, Gary's legacy, as far as your own work goes with Hyperborea, where can we see Gary's influence? What has he changed
I
in
would
you?
say it's all over the place, because to me, Gary was the greatest creator in this industry. I think that he was was a genius, and he was a great creator, and he was inspiring to so many of us, so that even, so many of us that have worked for him, so, I know that there are a lot of folks who are still around today that worked with him back in the heyday of TSR, when life was different and the hobby was exploding, and they had those huge offices there and all kinds of developments going on, to the leaner years, when, Gary was basically working with guys like me and working out of his home, and working and communicating via email and telephone conversations. So I think that Gary has had this huge impact for so many years, for so many decades, and I think that he will continue to. It's funny, like, I don't even know what game it was. One of my kids was playing recently, and it had hit points and armor class in it. And so I said, "Do you know what those come from?" And my son had no idea. And I'm like, "That's from D&D." He's like, "Oh, okay, cool." And it's like, there's so many, in pop culture, I think it's become so much more recognizable now in recent years for whatever reason. When we all thought it was a dying hobby,
Right.
it's had this, and kudos to the folks at Wizards of the Coast for taking advantage of that and pushing new materials out and grabbing a whole new audience and getting other people back into the hobby. But I think that we're at some type of new golden age, but we still need to look back and reflect on, especially if you're a creator, at what Gary did and what he means to this hobby.
Yeah, absolutely true. It's the absolutely true there. For myself, I remember I had a conversation with my good friend Jeremy about this to some degree, and I was telling him one of the reasons why I marvel at Gary is you have to understand that when he was doing this, there was no manual. You mentioned before, you could calibrate your own work off of someone else's. Well, he was the one inventing the template.
Right.
He
I've
was the
had
one that
people.
yeah, I mean, there was no, he was the one that was setting the rules for all of us to follow in years that would come. So to me, that kind of underscores his genius more than anything to me, in
Yeah.
that I looked at the people talk about the Baroque design of first edition to some degree, and I can see that, but have to forget, this is iteration 1.0. I mean, this
Right.
is original source document. So the fact that it is as compelling as it is, and it works as well as it does, it speaks volumes about his singular genius.
Right.
Now, you mentioned that you are a
And
Socanth fan. What other uh, adventures out there besides that and Tomoe-chan were some of your favorites?
um, well, I really enjoyed Castle Amber. I think Tom Moldway was a great writer as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
And I was actually, I guess I didn't appreciate it when I was a teenager when I ran it. And actually, I played it before I ran it. Um, but I didn't realize at the time that it's probably the first D&D module that has Clark Ashton Smith inspiration in it.
Mhm.
Um, so, yeah, he was definitely, and oh yes, and I definitely love the U series that you mentioned
Ah.
earlier.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was the three. Let's see, I'm trying to remember all the names of them.
Oh well, while you're
I can't
thinking back
remember
at
the latter two.
while you're thinking about it, I was
The
Amber.
Beyond Salt Marsh, obviously.
Mhm. Castle Amber for me. I remember having a hard time finding that locally. It was killing me too because that Errol Otis cover of it is just awesome. That of the that particular book. Um, I thought that was just dynamite. And you
Right.
mentioned Sakanth. For me, I think, by the way, I'm the only one in America that pronounces it that way because I remember being in a vacuum sort of when I got that, and that's how it looked to me. So it was Sakanth. but I remember seeing that, and the dual booklet inside of it just blew my little
Sure. Yeah.
mind so much with all the new monsters, all the new magic items. There's full
Yeah.
artifacts in there. It just, that book more than anything has probably been I would say for me, the biggest influence that I've had
Yeah.
probably in
Same
the way
here.
I write games.
Yeah,
And
that
as a
was
matter
my
of fact, for my
favorite.
Patreon, I don't know everyone out there. I think Gitano received it by now. January's module was the mini module for my patron was was called the Abscess, and it was a short adventure to be run in between Socanth and the Forgotten Temple of
Thursday.
Thurisden. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of like a bridge adventure if you need
Oh,
more
that's pretty
experience with
cool.
things. So yeah, I thought that was it's kind of my ode to that
Yeah.
adventure. It was always a favorite of mine. I notice here.
Of course, I also liked White Plume Mountain. I thought that was a fun romp. It's
Yeah,
more.
that adventure too. You mentioned Black Razor. I just remember the artifacts in there, the weapons, and just saying, and the map too that Errol Lotus drew with Dragotha in it, and Thingizard, beware her potions, and there was
Yeah,
so much
yeah. So
flavor
there
in it.
was
It's like,
Black Razor, there was Whelm,
mhm.
and what was the trident?
Wave,
I forget what the name of the trident was.
wave.
Wave. Yeah, there you
Mhm. Yeah.
go.
And in fact, they did a redo of that module for the 21st, 25th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons for TSR, and that was they introduced a new one called Frost Razor in that one. So
Oh,
uh,
really?
yeah, so that was it. It
I didn't
was
catch that.
so. It was a mediocre adventure. It wasn't really anything to write home about, but it did introduce a couple
Uh-huh.
interesting concepts. I know that most people hate it because they kind of did some interesting things with Caraptus's history that probably weren't very welcome by fandom. Gaetano LaFavi over here mentions, I love Jeff took the whole fantasy setting and made it new. Here wasn't a whole world, but a portion of one with a rich tapestry of mythos and unique physicality that wasn't the norm, with elements like the 13-year calendar, the weird orbit of the realm, and its shifting periods of extended sunlight and darkness to create an alien feel to the realm is so out of the average sandbox.
Oh, cool. That's very nice to hear. I'm glad that, he enjoys that. We had a lot of fun developing that. So what he's referring to is in Hyperborea. Hyperborea is a flat Earth setting in which the seas spill eternal off the edge of the world, and it's a single continent landmass in the center of it, with various islands about the Hyperborean Sea. And so the way this flat Earth setting works is that it has a 13-year cycle. And in that 13-year cycle, there is 1 year of complete light and 1 year of complete darkness. And the intervening years are sort of build up to that. So it's kind of fun because you know, you can have a campaign in which the hours of light are waning. And it's sort of a build up to it. It does put a little bit more pressure on the game referee to keep track of time. You
Right.
want to know like what month it is, especially when you're approaching like the year of complete light or the year of complete darkness, and you get to that point where like we're like, okay, there's only 40 minutes of sunlight left per day at this point, and it does create this sort of alien feel, and it works well in this sword and sorcery pulp fiction type of setting.
Absolutely, I think so. I think it's like Gaetano said, it's so innovative. But I do have another question here from one of our viewers, Boot Knife, who is asking about what inspired the weird part of Hyperborea's fantasy. His first example of it was in the Lamia's Heart, where Frost Ray Gun was introduced. So, what was the inspiration for these things?
So I do like other writers too, like Carl Edward Wagner, and so in his types of books, um, which would a lot of them focus around Cain, who was a swordsman and a sorcerer. It's kind of like Elric, but a lot different than Elric in his disposition and his history. But but having these sort of technological artifacts in the setting that are actually from some type of age from long ago. So like futuristic artifacts, but they're from the past, from a different
Hmm.
age to be discovered. It really gives this sort of weird alien feel to the setting.
Right. When I think of Greyhawk in terms of that, sometimes the first notion, Black Knight mentions that Barrier Peaks, but for me, I
Of
think of
course.
Blackmore more than that. That you see a lot of that through like the Temple of the Frog, and
Right.
you see that with the City of the Gods. A lot of the and Gary's and Dave Arneson before that, the riff on that seems like there's a little bit maybe of that going on there. I thought that was really cool. Uh, Another one of our viewers here is watching. It mentions great setting, gives lots of room for the ref to make Hyperborea their own. It really expanded my reading of weird fiction and gave me enthusiasm to run my first convention games back in 2012. So
Oh, that's really nice.
yeah, that's it's so cool, and I know I can't speak for it myself so much, but it's got to be so gratifying when you hear the way that Hyperborea is influencing people, and that they're taking it, they're running with it. I mean, maybe more than
Yeah,
anything, that's where you see Gary's influence.
I hope so. I mean, it is really gratifying to me that the game resonates with other people because I never created it to fill some type of market niche or anything like that, or to exploit some untapped market to make money. The idea behind it was to make a game that I wanted to play with my beer drinking buddies. And so it expanded from there. And the fact that it resonates with people, that people don't just buy the books to stick them on a shelf. They actually play the hell out of the game, to steal a line from Matt Finch. And that's great to me. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. when I see people, I see pictures of somebody with a castle module or the shirt, and they're at a show. I mean,
Isn't that great?
oh wow, it just yeah, there's nothing like it for me. I can't. And I think for any creator, it just validates it. So I will go ahead and I will, while I do that, I'll show you that not only do I have Hyperborea, I have the big old box set. I'm an
That's
OG.
the original.
I am an OG of Hyperborea. Okay, so yeah, I've definitely your stuff has been very well received by the market for sure. And the last question I think I want to ask you about Greyhawk, going back to your history with that, is we talked a lot about how working with Gary was very influential and how it a lot of design aesthetic things. But how did it change you as a person? Do you think getting a chance to work with your hero and now that you can look at it in hindsight, what do you think of that whole? What do you make of it all?
Well, it was it was a big transition in my life because um, I had been struggling as a writer, as I mentioned, and it was hard to make ends meet back then, and I had a lot of close people around me who were, uh, you know, encouraging me and telling me to keep doing what I do, and telling me that I was good at it, and so, but to have to the experience, to have the opportunity to work with a man who was one of my idols was was um, was definitely life changing for me. It gave me the confidence to continue to do these things. And after Gary passed away, which was a really sad time, um, I reflected on that for a while before I decided that I would create my own type of game and setting influenced by my favorite stuff, but also taking into account what I had learned from Gary, and not just working with him, but having read so many of the various D&D books by him and by his various collaborators. So it was very enlightening for me. It was a very positive experience, and it continues to be to this day.
Yeah, I can't imagine what that must have been. Again, I keep thinking about. I try to put myself in your shoes there a little bit, and imagine how just surreal it must have been to be getting these emails back and forth and having him comment on your particular take, knowing it's Castle Greyhawk. It's his big, his magnum opus, and you're the one. He's sharing this with to some degree. I just think it's
Right.
so.
Well, it kind of starts off with like you're kind of overwhelmed, and at first you're a little bit starstruck by it, but after after the months go by and the emails go by and you're going back and forth, and then you realize that that he's a gamer, you're a gamer, and you're shooting back. You're both throwing shit on the wall to a certain degree, and seeing what sticks. And he's a regular guy, but of course he was brilliant, and he was this awesome creator that we all adored. But you start to compartmentalize that, and you're just like, you're working with the guy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Uh, Over here, Zach Schooley mentions we need another box set release. So, well, you can't have mine, but maybe we're talking to a guy that might be able to help you out here. So,
Yeah, they're a little tougher to deal with, those box sets, but I would love to do something again eventually.
yeah, absolutely. It's just such a cool presentation of the product. But that being said, yeah, I can see where the second edition of it is gorgeous, which I have back here, but it's a little bit less wieldy for me to show off.
Yeah.
Uh, that
Your hardback doesn't get crushed in Brazil somewhere that you then have to send out a new box set out.
Oh no, brutal.
Yeah.
As somebody right now who is doing a lot of shipping and sometimes international, I feel your pain.
Right.
That's rough. The Mega Dungeon should be a box set. Black Knight says over here. Um,
Yeah, that's possible.
okay, so yeah, is there anyone else over there? If you've got any questions for Jeff before we go ahead and we sign off, go ahead and shoot. We're kind of past the area where I had scripted the our I give a script for all of our
Well,
guests.
one thing I think we were remiss in mentioning was GaryCon.
Oh
Uh,
yeah,
uh, what a
absolutely.
what a what a great celebration of his life and legacy that small convention in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin is.
I'm so glad
You and
you
I see
mentioned
each other
that.
there every year, And so I would encourage anybody who's watching this now, or maybe watch it later on, that to definitely check out GaryCon. If you're interested in things Greyhawk and Gygaxian, it's such a great celebration of his career and his creations.
What are you going to be doing at GaryCon this year?
So I'm going to be running several Hyperborea events. This will be the third year in a row, actually, that I've been invited to run Celebrity Hyperborea, which is a Saturday night game, and there will be, to my knowledge, in my games so far. Well, last year we had Skip Williams and Errol Otis in the game, and Luke Gygax has taken part in it in the past, and so it's different. It's different great creators from the industry, but also different participants of the con that get to play with us as well. So that's a fun event, and you know, just getting to reconnect with a lot of old friends. You know, whether it's playing in a game together, rolling some dice, and talking in funny voices, or meeting at the bar, or whatever happens.
Our good buddy Rich Franks says that Jeff will be drinking Spotted Cow at GaryCon. Count on that.
Right, I will. No doubt about it.
So many people are asking me right now, what's the next big thing from Jeff and from Northwind? So that's everybody seems to want to know.
Okay, well, the plan was that we were going to do custom dice, and that still may be the plan. But our dice manufacturer ran into some problems, and we had to switch.
Okay.
We had to switch to a different manufacturer that can achieve the look and the feel of what we're looking for. And I'm very particular, as people would know that, you know, that pick up our adventures, about how specific and particular I am about how things work out. So the dice are going to be custom dice. It's probably going to be a custom pouch as well if they come in. And so I'm looking at different options for that. But in the meantime, also have some different adventure modules. John Bingham, who has been a longtime artist working with us since 2010, I believe. He wrote an adventure that we're going to be publishing. So I've been working on doing some editing for that. That's a longer form adventure, like many of our other ones. But we also have a couple of shorter adventures that we may do before then. One is by editor David Prada. It's called The Late Trapper's Lament. And then one by myself called The Ice Sphinx, which I've run a few times.
Several of you.
Several. What's that?
Oh, no, please go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, so there's different projects in different states of completion right now. I want to say the dice are the next project that we're going to do, but it may not work out that way.
Do you expect it to be kickstarted, or is that going to be that's awesome. Yep. Again, that you guys can always count on Northwind when it comes to kickstarting, and that's one of the great things about Jeff and his company, that you guys, I don't know how many of you have been involved in the Kickstarter programs with them, but it's always a great experience. I was going to mention that for those of you who know Dave Prada, he's also known to the Greyhawk community as DM Prada. He was a big contributor for a long time on Cannon Fire. Big, very well-known contributor that many of you might not recognize because of the handle. But let's see,
he still runs Greyhawk. He still runs Greyhawk regularly.
And let's see, Jeff is the gold standard of RPG Kickstarters. As far as GaryCon, I saw a couple people are mentioning me now for GaryCon. I will be running 4 adventures at GaryCon. They're going to be 3-hour first edition games. The first one is going to be called, pardon me. The first one of them is going to be called to the Lost City of the Elders, which is a Rob Kuntz adventure, which Martin Kinnon's fantastic adventure. You'll note Lost City of the Elders was mentioned in that.
And that's one of my favorite ones.
It'll be a riff off of that. The second one, the first one that I just finished, is called From Dark Roses, Blackthorns Grow. It's going to be a sequel to my Slavers adventures. And if any of you happen to have read A2, that title should probably tell you what the a little bit about maybe what the you can expect there. And the third one that I'm working on right now is the wrap up to the Gnome series, which is Squaring the Circle. That'll be the denouement of that, which is obviously for those of you who have gotten a chance to play it, it's inspired by Magnificent Seven. Jeff, it's an adventure where I've taken 7 gnomes, kind of all they all worship Merlin, so they've all got that
Okay.
Wild West thing going on. It's always been, I thought it was kind of a fun play on that. It's my fun module.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
and the other one is I'm going to be running a first edition top secret game this time
Oh,
around, which is
oh, okay.
Operation Exorcist. Last
And
year I got a
I
chance.
believe Merle Rasmussen is going to be at the con.
Yeah, actually he was going to play with us last year, but there
Oh,
were some scheduling issues and he didn't get a chance
okay.
to.
And I believe I'm going to see him at Total Con as well in 1 month from now.
Yeah, yeah. Merle's such a great guy too. He's one of the again. Every time I see you, Jeff, I'm one of the way I introduce you is one of the true gentlemen in our industry, and Merle is another one that like that. That's just
He's a lot more well dressed than I am, though. He's
no, no, no.
always
I
well
wouldn't say
dressed.
that. You're just very well spoken, and I love the way you carry yourself. You're one of my role models when it came to how to
Oh,
deal with
thank
the
you.
public. Actually, when you know, you're when Castle Entertainment was first starting out, you know, you looked at people that you've had experiences with as to what you know how you want to deal with different situations. And when it came for me, how I felt like a deal, I wanted to be like that. So
Oh, thank
that's
you.
your
That's really
legacy
nice
to
to hear.
me in addition to many other things, but that
That's
I
kind
always
of you.
liked that, and that's one of the
When
reasons
I,
why I wanted you to be on the show.
that's really nice of you. I appreciate it.
Let's see, we've got a couple other things here. Get a D13 in that Kickstarter. Somebody mentions the Black
No.
Knight. Don't forget Total Con in Massachusetts. Jeff's home con coming up in February.
Yeah, that's coming up. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be great.
What are you going to be doing there?
So I'll have a booth there, selling all our latest stuff, including the 2 new modules that we recently kickstarted. So that'll actually be the first convention that we showcase the 2 new modules. And so I'll be running different games. We're actually doing a stream pre-con game, so it'll be streamed. I don't know if it's going to be a live stream though, but it's going to be filmed, and it's going to be probably about like a short game. It might be only a few hours. But that's going to be a lot of fun. So people will be able to see the game in action.
Okay.
And so different stuff like that. Yeah.
Black Knight again mentions he seems to be very well informed on your itinerary. He believes there's still some spots open in a couple Hyperborea games, not Jeff's though. Those fill in about 2 minutes after the tickets open. And now that's something else that I just very briefly I wouldn't mind talking about. I'm at the point right now that I'm in the same boat, and it's really gratifying that when your games are released, they're gone in less than 5 minutes. How do you balance that between getting new players and exposing your product to new people?
Well, the first thing I had to do was fire all the guys from my regular Tuesday night group that wanted to show up in those games, because I would I would say, hey, we just played a couple of nights ago. Why are you at my table? So, so it was. I'd be like, guys, it's flattering and everything, but let's give a few other people a chance to try out the Hyperborea game, right? But so yeah, it's always nice. You get a combination of you get people from all walks of life. Sometimes you get younger people who are new to gaming.
Mhm.
Sometimes you can get people who will say they only play older edition games, and they heard that the Hyperborea game was an older school style game, so they wanted to try it out. And you can run into some other people who perhaps have only played games like Pathfinder and 5th edition, but I think a lot of those people want to branch out, and they're getting more curious about the roots of the hobby and how games were played back in the 70s and 80s. So there's a lot of the newer people who have come into it are definitely getting more curious about older style play.
Right. It's funny you should say that. When I was at Gamehole this year, there was a young gentleman who came to my table. And he'd pre-signed up for and he says, "I'm only a 5th edition player, but your game sounded really cool. and I was a little nervous about how it would be received, but the kid had a great time and said he wants to check out more first edition stuff based on that. I mean, it feels so good when you hear that from people.
Right, right. I mean, you can run into some stumbling blocks with some of those people. Don't get me
Sure.
like I tell the story. I've told this story before. I'm not sure if I ever mentioned it to you at GaryCon, but I had a young man about a year or two ago who showed up to play in one of my games, and he informed me at some point during the game, while other players were talking to me and telling me stuff that their characters were doing in a certain situation, he informed me that he had rolled an intimidation check on the bartender and now wanted to know what the bartender knew. And I said, "You rolled what?" "I rolled an intimidation roll." "Well, what exactly is that in this game?" And he said, "I don't know. I rolled a D20 on my charisma."
That mechanic.
And I said, "Well, what are you saying to the bartender?" And he said, "What does it matter? I made my roll."
That
so
mechanic,
well,
the diplomacy, intimidation, social skills has really been detrimental in a lot of ways, I think, to modern gaming. Because
so you're trying to find out, where this is going. You want a little bit of role play. I don't expect everyone to, be a thespian and be this flamboyant actor going out. Some people enjoy that. Other people want to just say what their character said.
Right.
But I do agree with you, though, in that sometimes some of those roles in the newer edition games can sort of take out that opportunity to have the role play in the role playing game.
Mm-hmm. You're right, absolutely. And when I have had a problem with latter edition players, it's almost always been because of those mechanics too. They have been trained that whole idea, the notion that you make a roll, the effect happens. Well, not necessarily.
Right.
In your earlier editions, the Black Knight that was speaking to you before, I guess is a handle on another site is Sausage. You might recognize it.
Oh, okay, it's Bob.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
an old friend of mine.
Oh, awesome.
I've known Bob for years. Bob actually introduced me to the Call of Cthulhu game back in the 80s, which got me to start reading the short stories.
Mm-hmm.
So
Are you
Bob
a fan?
is an old dear friend of mine.
Are you a fan of the Cthulhu stuff?
Oh yes, absolutely. I think I've read all of Lovecraft's works at this point.
Yeah.
So I definitely a huge inspiration to me. In fact, one of the things that was eye-opening to me was the Lovecraft story, The Shadow Out of Time. In The Shadow Out of Time, Lovecraft, through a series of passages, links his works with Clark Ashton Smith's Hyperborea and the Hyborian Age of Conan, or it may have been Cull's Volusia, but whatever the case may be. It was sort of eye-opening for me as a developer of setting material, just to see this master weird fiction writer take these various elements and combine them all together into one vision of how things can work together, and I just thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like, taking this conversation full circle, looking at the chat tonight, it seems to me like that's what people are doing with Hyperborea and Greyhawk. People are making it and they're integrating it. Again, when you look at the Darlene map, the stuff that we were exposed to initially, it's a section of Earth. It's not, the entire map by far. They're taking Hyperborea and putting it, as another continent on there, just as valid as the Flyness. And in that respect, just as Gary's work is resonating with us and is going to live forever in our fandom, so too is yours, Jeff. I mean, that's got to feel.
I would be flattered if it stands the test of time. That would be great to me.
Well, I often talk about, to me, and I told this to Luke Gygax, and I've told this to Jim Ward as well, that we're Gary's children that he never knew he had. A lot of us. I know that as a young man, that was my idol growing up, and I would read everything he did and hung on all of his, everything he said, and I didn't have
his editorials in Dragon magazine. I would eat those up.
Yeah, and I didn't really. I kind of grew up by myself a lot, and so he was the kind of the light by which I navigated a lot of my young life. So and I don't think that I'm the only one like that out there. And so he's the father that we all didn't know we had. As a result, he's going to live forever through
Right.
us and through Greyhawk. But
Yeah,
I think that
absolutely.
some of the stuff that you do now, I'm looking at and reading that, and that's got to feel good.
Yeah, that's really nice to hear. I mean, I'm happy that it resonates with people, and if it stands the test of time, I would be honored and flattered.
All right, everybody. Well, I think that we're going to wrap up the conversation on that note. For everybody out there, thank you very much, all of you, for coming and getting a chance to chat with Jeff and I. And I know for myself, this is something I really look forward to. I'm a huge enthusiast of Hyperborea, and I'm a big supporter of everything that Jeff does. So
Thank
I
you.
hope that all you guys out there had a good time, and tune in next month. You guys are gonna. Hopefully, I can have another great guest for you. And Jeff, anything you want to say before I sign us off?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Carlos. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun, and I hope we have the opportunity to sit down and chat at GaryCon
Oh,
in
we
a
will,
few
man.
short
We
weeks.
will. Hang around here just after we go offline, so we can say thank you for following Boot Knife. I appreciate it. We'll chat a little bit. We'll wrap things up, and for all of you that again that joined us, thanks so much, and you guys have a nice evening.
Goodbye. Excelsior.
Until the star break.